All right, I think we'll get started. Thanks for coming out tonight. My name is Sadie Urban. I'm the events coordinator here at the Kickapoo Valley Reserve. The talk we're having tonight is part of a year-long lecture series called Driftless Dialogue. It's funded in part by the Kickapoo Reforestation Fund, also known as the VII Fund. And also some of the refreshments out there, we received assistance by the Friends of the KVR. So the topic tonight, we're going to cover two different projects that are also funded by the Kickapoo Reforestation Fund. First, we'll have Mark Rickenbach, who's a UW-Madison professor and UW Extension specialist, and he'll talk about a Silvopasture project. No? Other way around? Oh, sorry about that. He'll be talking about a Faith in Forest initiative. And then we'll have Diane Mayerfield talk about a Silvopasture project. So sorry for mixing that up. So I think we'll start off with Mark. Yep. Thank you.
So good evening. It's nice to be here. What I'm going to share with you might have kind of the shorter of the two talks, and it's really to share with you this announcement of an event, and I'll talk a little bit of the background of that and kind of where this idea came from and what the role of kind of the VII Fund is in making this project work. For those of you not familiar, there's a program created by the Aldo Leopold Foundation. It's called the Land Ethic Leaders, and it's kind of an advanced training for landowners and resource professionals to really kind of delve into what it means to be stewards of the land. And so this is a special Land Ethic Leaders that really looks at the connection between people's stewardship of the land and its connection to faith. Lots of faith cultures have a strong kind of stewardship ethic embedded in them. And so this is going to be an event where people can go and talk about how their faith informs their stewardship. And so this is an event that's going to be presented in partnership by the Aldo Leopold Foundation, Camp Gray, the Churches Center for Land and People, Southwest Badger, Viterbo University, and the American Forest Foundation. What you will notice is it does not say the University of Wisconsin-Madison, nor does it say the Kickapoo Valley Reforestation Fund. And so I'm going to give you where this project started and how we got to this place in kind of my short time. So this project really started with, there's a project going on here in the valley called, and throughout southwest Wisconsin, called the Driftless Forest Initiative. And it's really a tool that's, an approach that's really trying to find new ways to engage private landowners. And so it used kind of a social marketing approach. And so when talking to Alana Koszelek at Aldo Leopold Foundation, we wanted to try something different in looking, can we pick portions of landowners in the Kickapoo Valley who we can connect in some way and deliver a program to them. And so you start combing through the data, and we've done some survey work in this part of the world, and what you find is one of the key connections for a lot of landowners, not just in the Kickapoo Valley, but throughout southwest Wisconsin and frankly throughout the US, is their connection to faith communities. And particularly in this part of the world, it would be Christian. And so we started doing some research on what are the intellectual roots of that. There's been a fair amount of research that looks at the connection and a lot of humanities research that looks at the connection between faith and stewardship and the connection to environmental justice and those types of topics. And so we started developing an idea that said, okay, how can we take advantage of this in reaching to landowners? And so the real research question of our project is religion or faith an effective way to engage landowners around land stewardship? And so we started thinking, well, how are we going to do this? We should probably plan an event, and that should allow us to get people to think about these things, and then we can evaluate that to figure out what happened. So as we're planning this event, it strikes some of us that, wait, this is going to be about religion, and I'm from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. There's this thing we have the kind of church-state divide, and what you don't want to find out is you're on the wrong side of that line when you go to hold an event like this. So it was at that point where myself and the university and the VII Fund kind of stepped out of the picture. Luckily, the American Forest Foundation, which is a national NGO, came up with the money to completely fund the entire event. So they're going to fund the event. And what we're going to continue to do in our university role is actually evaluate that and say, is this an effective way to reach landowners? That's an important academic question because we hear that from people around the country about how do we use people's faith and the ideas of stewardship to reach landowners and improve stewardship using community churches as a mechanism. So that's kind of where we are. What I've got here is the announcement. The event's going to be August 20th through the 22nd. It's going to be at the Leopold Center. If you've never been there, it's a beautiful facility in Baraboo. And so this is going to mix some of the teachings of Ada Leopold as well as people exploring some faith ideas around that. If you are interested in participating or know someone who might, I've got some handouts. You're welcome to take one. I've got more than one for each of you, so you can take one and give one to a friend. So if you want that, you can collect that afterwards. If anybody has a quick question, I can answer that. If not, I would turn it over to Diane, who can share a bit more about that.
Has some kind of collaboration like this been done in any other state?
To our knowledge, not in a forestry context. The place it has been done, and I think it's this Church's Center for Land and the People has done it, I think, in agricultural settings. So developing criteria, I think particularly for Catholic landowners to think about how they manage their land and being good environmental stewards. And I think they actually developed kind of a recognition program for Catholic farmers who did a certain type of stewardship on their land. So this is basically what we want to do is follow up and say is, do people have different conversations with different people because of going through an experience like this? Or do they go back and talk to the same landowners they would have if they participated in just another landowner workshop? So is this going to help us reach new and different landowners? Because we know that's kind of a serious issue about woodland stewardship in general across not just Southwest Wisconsin, but the entire state. Other questions? If not, thank you very much. And I'll turn it over to Diane.
Thank you, Mark. All right, my name is Diane Meyerfeld, and I'll start out by just telling you a little bit how I got to do the work that I'm going to tell you about today. I work for Extension, and I am the Sustainable Agriculture Outreach Coordinator for Extension. And before I started working in Wisconsin, I worked in Iowa. And there is an idea that goes back a long time and is practiced all over the world that is part of sustainable agriculture called agroforestry. And you'll learn a little bit about it as I go through my presentation. But basically, the idea is that what we think of as agriculture, growing annual crops or growing fruit crops, can be combined with woody crops, trees primarily, but also shrubs and other things. And this was an idea I was first exposed to when I was working in Iowa, and it was kind of a hard sell for the Iowa landscape, which is a lot of corn and soybeans and a few exotic areas in the corners where we have alfalfa too, or where Iowa has alfalfa too. But then I moved to Wisconsin and was working here for a while, and I began to wonder why there wasn't more done with agroforestry in Wisconsin, because Wisconsin is a very different setting. We have a lot of forests. We have a very diverse agriculture. And so I became interested in that, and I, in fact, after many, many years, decided to return to school as a student and use that as an opportunity to do some research and sort of catalyze something in a small way in agroforestry in Wisconsin. And the area that I was most interested in, there are 5 different agroforestry practices, but the area that I thought was a logical place to start in Wisconsin it was this area called Silvopasture, which is combining grazing with trees in some way. As you, I'm sure all know, particularly in this part of the state, grazing is a really important part of Wisconsin agriculture because of our strong dairy base and because of our strong organic sector. And it just also happens to be very well adopted in Wisconsin, where about 23% of the dairy farms practice grazing and a large percent of it practice management intensive grazing, and a large percentage of the beef farms do too. So when I went back and started in a PhD program at the university, one of the ideas that I brought with me from working in sustainable agriculture is that rather than kind of picking a research topic based on my own inclinations, it makes sense to talk to the people for whom I'm presumably doing this research first. And so I approached the Newsom Fund, the Kickapoo Valley Reforestation Fund, to try to get some funding to support me to interview both resource professionals in this area and farmers and landowners on their thoughts about this idea of silvopasture. So I'm going to step back now and give you just a little introduction, a little more introduction to what we mean by silvopasture, and then I'll tell you a little bit about what my interviews have revealed so far. I'm still thinking about them. I still will probably talk to a few more people, and then finish up with where I hope to go from here. So what is silvopasture? As I said, in the most basic sense, it combines grazing and trees. Specifically, it's a system that combines trees, livestock, and the forages, the plants that the animals will eat, in an intentional and integrated way. And the trees provide long-term returns, and the livestock and forage generate more short-term income. And it's, you know, as I said, it's the intentional combining of them, and it's thinking of them as a system, rather than just thinking of one component and putting it in the same space as the other components, but not managing the other components. One of the important caveats is that it is not just letting your cows in the woods. That was one of the things when I came from an agricultural background, and I started working with Mark, who comes from a forestry background. And I said, I'm interested in silvopasture, and his first question to me was, does that mean cows in the woods? And coming from an agriculture background, I hadn't even thought about that. I thought about planting trees in pasture. So I realized that in a forestry context, it's very important to make that clarification. There are different ways you can establish it. So you can establish it by planting trees in open pasture, which was my initial vision. You can also establish it starting with existing woods by managing the woods to make them a good place for livestock. Usually that involves thinning the woods and in some ways, either allowing the forages to come in naturally or often actually planting them. So this is a practice that agroforestry is practiced worldwide, as I said, and silvopasture is practiced worldwide. It's not that familiar in the United States. Had any of you heard the term silvopasture before reading it? And that's pretty common. So within the US, the place where it's best known is in the southeastern US, because it's practiced in conjunction with plantation, short rotation pine forests. So there's as you may know, there's a lot of our softwoods come from the southeast US, where you can grow a tree to enough size to harvest for saw timber in about 25 to 30 years. They have longer growing seasons than we do. And so those plantations, they plant the trees in rows, and in between the rows, before the trees get very big, there's open space. And so you can turn the cows into that open space, and they can keep your grass down in between the open space. You can get that short-term income while you're waiting. As you can see, though, these are all systems in the southeast that are based primarily on fast-growing conifers. There is some in the southeast that's also done with pecan orchards, so that it's not all that way, but those are all trees, those are all systems that are very different than what we have here. There's almost no discussion of silvopasture. There's been almost no research on it in the upper Midwest. That's beginning to change now. I'm working pretty closely with another graduate student, Keith Keeley, who I believe presented here last year. And we are both very interested in this practice and working in this area of the state together. So my question is, can it work in the Driftless, can it work in this part of Wisconsin? There are some big differences from the parts of the country, particularly the southeast, but also the northwest. There are different policy contexts, some which might favor it, some which might not favor it. So one thing you may all be familiar with, use value tax law. Are you all landowners in this area? No. So Wisconsin's tax law is set up so that it's in order to help keep agricultural lands, keep lands from development pressure. It's set up so that agricultural lands are taxed at their use value, in other words, the income they're generating, rather than their potential development value. Because otherwise there'd be huge pressure, especially around the cities, to sell land off that's in agriculture off for development. But one of the perhaps unintended consequences of this law is that there's a category of agricultural land called wooded pasture, which is the least expensive tax category in the tax law. It's less expensive than woods that are not used for agriculture. And so if you're a landowner, particularly if you're a farmer and a landowner who has livestock, this puts a lot of pressure on you to declare all of your woodlands pasture and to allow livestock into all of your woodlands, because it significantly decreases your tax burden. We also have a managed forest program, which is another way that as a forest landowner you can decrease your tax burden. You can develop an approved forest management plan, and that decreases your tax burden. In contrast to the use value tax law, with the managed forest program, you are not allowed to do any grazing. It is all for management of your woodland. You can have different management goals. They can be for wildlife, they can be for timber, they can be for other purposes, for recreational purposes. But you do have to manage it for the forest, and it excludes grazing. So those are two different policy context things that are unique to our state. Obviously, the ecological and social context is different here from other parts of the country as well. We have steep hillsides and highly erodible land to deal with. And we have hardwoods. We're dealing with a very different forest ecosystem than in the south or the northwest, where this has generally been practiced. We do have a strong grazing sector, and we have many regional programs and organizations that could either help provide information about this practice if they support it, or that could oppose the practice. So that's kind of the policy context that I entered into this work. So my question is, what do farmers and landowners think? And also, what do educators and the resource professionals who provide information to landowners and farmers think? So I conducted a couple of focus groups. Two focus groups with resource professionals, and included in those groups were 4 foresters, 3 people who are primarily agricultural advisors, and 3 people who are natural resource people or environmental specialists. And then 1 focus group with 7 farmers, all of whom practice grazing. I wanted to make sure that I dealt with farmers who do grazing. And then in addition, I was interested because a number of people told me it's important to talk to the Amish because they are significant landowners in the Kickapoo, and they have livestock, and they work with wood. So I spent a day driving around and just going to Amish farms and asking if I could talk to them, and 3 farmers were willing to talk to me. I was not able to record the conversations. They did not want to be recorded. So the paraphrases from the Amish farmers that I will show to you later are just based on my notes and my memory. They're not actually written down from a recording. So what did people have to say? The first set of questions I asked was, what's going on now? You know, do farmers in this area have trees in their pastures, or do they graze their woods? And so these are the 4 cards. I had 4 little visual scenarios I gave them just to give them something to help them describe what they're doing. And the answer is, yes, they do graze their woods, and they have trees in their pasture. And it's when I talked to the professionals, they said, yes, there's grazing in woods, and no, there's not deliberate planting Uh-oh.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
It's fine.
There's not deliberate planting of trees in a silvopasture context. And that's pretty much what the farmers said as well, although they deliberately are maintaining the trees in their pasture. And the people who are the agricultural professionals really didn't know much about what was going on with the woods grazing. Basically, it's a taboo topic because
It's on.
I just turned it on, sorry. Because there's been a long history going back to the 1800s of people burning their woods and of people allowing unrestricted grazing in the woods. And there's been a long history of foresters and ecologists worrying that causes a lot of damage, that it keeps regeneration from happening, that it causes erosion. And so what you get a situation now where when farmers allow their livestock in the woods, they just don't talk to any resource professionals about it because they know they're not supposed to do that. And the next question I asked was, what management issues are there with trees in the pasture? And this is a visual representation that I just got off the web. This is not from this part of the country. But one of the key issues that was brought up, this would be really the first issue that was brought up over and over again, is that if you don't have enough trees in the pasture, if you just have one or two, then you will get all the animals bunching under the trees. And this can cause a lot of different problems. The first problem that was mentioned is just that they cause compaction and trampling, and the vegetation goes, and so you get a mud puddle. You also get all the manure concentrated under the tree and not spread out nicely all over the field the way you want it. One farmer talked about transmission of mastitis when they congregate under the tree. The most dramatic problem that one farmer relayed was that if you get a storm and your cows are all bunched under the tree and there's a lightning strike, you can lose a lot of your cows really fast that way. And he told a story about when he was a kid and went out into the pasture and there were a lot of dead cows. And he had to go and tell his dad that there were dead cows under the tree in the pasture. There are other management issues. One of them is maintaining fence. If there are a lot of trees, then trees fall on the fence and they break the fence. One of them is harvesting hay. If you're doing grazing and you want to be able to manage your pastures, there are times of the year when your grass is growing really fast and your cows aren't eating it as fast as it's growing, and you want to be able to bale that hay. But if you have a bunch of trees in your pasture and they're dropping branches, depending on your equipment, that can be a problem for doing that procedure. There are a couple of other issues, and this thing doesn't show the notes, so I hope I'm remembering the main ones. But there are a number of issues that both the educators and the farmers brought up with trees in the pasture. So here's the quote. The first one is the quote from an agricultural extension agent saying, "We tend to discourage producers from grazing or setting up paddocks that have a single tree in them because the animals will concentrate for shade and then all the nutrients are concentrated." And the farmer said it in farmer language. And actually, I don't like trees in a paddock because the cattle, when it's warm or hot, they go under them and bunch up. But that quote also tells you one of the most important reasons that people are interested in silvopasture, which is the cattle need some place to go out of the sun. It's actually a major problem for both dairy and beef cattle if it's too hot. And especially after the summer of 2012, there was a lot of increased interest in providing shade. Research in Missouri and again in the Southeast has showed a really big increase in the amount of milk that dairy cattle will give and in the amount of daily gain that beef cattle will have if they have shade versus if they don't have shade when the weather is hot. And in the winter, the same is true for shelter from the wind. If they don't have shelter from the wind, the cold weather can really bother them. if they have wind shelter, they can usually cope with amazingly cold weather without too much trouble. There are a number of other things that people mentioned as advantages, as potential advantages for silvopasture. One of them is that people were very interested in controlling brush and controlling invasives. And they talked about how the woods can be impenetrable and how cattle can be used, cattle or goats can be used to open that up. It is a two-edged sword. You have to manage them carefully, because if you just leave them in there, not only will they get rid of the brush, they'll get rid of everything else. They will damage the trees. And you certainly won't get any regeneration of new trees. And that's another big concern that people mentioned about silvopasture is how do you manage it so you can get young trees coming in. Ultimately, the sort of consensus was, especially from the foresters, they weren't crazy about this idea. They were very concerned about the idea of mixing woods and livestock, but they recognized that due to the tax law, and they recognized the reality that the woods are being grazed, and they would rather have the woods being grazed in a way where it's carefully managed and where the rotation is carefully managed than have the current system continue. So across the board, almost across the board, the people I talked to thought that silvopasture was definitely worth pursuing. They liked the idea, although they had a lot of questions about exactly how it will work. The Amish farmers had very diverse, I talked to three, I got three very different sorts of answers. I had talked to one who took what I think a view that most of the foresters would be comfortable with, which is that cows don't belong in the woods, that they cause damage in the woods, and that trees don't belong in the pasture. I talked to another one who was very excited about it, who has planted an orchard and is seriously thinking about having sheep graze in the orchard. And having animals graze in the orchard, using orchards as a basis for the silvopasture is also a question that came up in all three of the focus groups. There are concerns about using orchards, particularly because of the combination of fruit that may be eaten uncooked and having animals that are dropping manure. Even if you're not harvesting the fruit off the ground, our food safety regulations make us very uneasy about that combination. But so it's an interesting research question. Is there a way that you could manage that with timing or in any way? That's one possible area of research. So those were two, and then the third Amish farmer was kind of in between, was unsure, thought that the shade would be good for the animals, but was unsure about the impact of shade on the grass. And that very much reflected kind of my feeling before I went into this field. But the literature is the research from other parts of the country is surprisingly different from that, in that it says in many situations a light shade is actually good for the grass. It just changes the growth pattern. So you get grass greening up earlier in the spring, and you get grass doing better in the very hot, dry parts of the summer, but it doesn't grow as well during the period of peak growth. So like right now, when the grass is growing beautifully, it would be growing more slowly under shade, a light shade, not a dense shade. But it would grow better, it would grow more evenly over the course of the season. So in my interest in silvopasture, I'm not in any way recommending that a farmer who's doing grazing go to doing silvopasture throughout their farm. It would be one thing that would be in part of their pastures for shade, for also managing the woods animal interface, but not to be done uniformly. And this is, one thing that that I was surprised about, because I didn't ask questions about it at all, but that came out from all the focus groups, was a real concern about land prices, access to land, and the amount of land that is rented, because the landowners, you know, they're larger landowners, or because they're absentee landowners, or people owning it for recreational purposes. And it was phrased in different ways. The resource professionals were very direct. They talked about the problem of absentee landlords. They talked about the problem of loss of sort of owner-operated farms and access for young farmers. The farmers didn't use those terms in those direct ways, but they talked a lot about the young farmers, the beginning farmers, can't afford to get good land. And so there was this conversation that came up multiple times in that focus group, which is summed up in this interchange. The key is you probably can't own marginal land and make money, but the rich guy can own it, and you can give him what he wants with your management, with your animals. So 2 of the farmers in the focus group were young farmers who mostly are renting land from other people, are renting very marginal woods and so on, and using, in one case, goats, and in one case, beef cattle, in part to clear those forests and to try and convert them to a more savanna-like habitat. And that's another big goal that came up again in all of the focus groups, is that the natural landscape in this part of the state, historically, before European settlement, was a mix of some forest on the northern sides of the hills, but primarily in southwestern Wisconsin, we had a savanna landscape with widely scattered trees and a lot of open area in between that was maintained by a mix of fires and grazing. And so we've lost that landscape in large part. We're losing a lot of our oak woodlands, and there's the thought that using this management technique might be a more cost-effective way to bring savanna back than trying to do it with either mechanical thinning out of the woods or with burning, which has its own dangers and which also has to be done repeatedly. Obviously, grazing has to be done repeatedly, but you get income from it. So here's just a couple of other quotes that I thought were summed up some of the important things that came out of the focus groups. One is that this was a self-selected group of people. These were people who were willing to come to a focus group about mixing trees and pastures. So this is not like a results of a random survey, but the consensus from all those conversations were that people were really interested in the idea of combining trees and grazing. They were really interested in something in between keeping all livestock away from all trees and having all pastures be completely open. And that's a big change from what has been promoted in this part of the state. There was a lot of discussion about managing invasives, either as the direct purpose or as a side benefit of doing silvopasture.
Diane, did they mention a specific invasives they thought were most?
They mentioned a bunch. Different people had different hated species. Box elder was one person's hated species. Multiflora rose was another person. Garlic mustard was a third person. Now, I don't think silvopasture would manage garlic mustard. In fact, someone brought up that the cows might help spread it, but the deer and the squirrels are already spreading it and everything else. So prickly ash, buckthorn, all of them were mentioned. And there was some discussion about that actually forage value of some of these things is quite high, and beef cattle at the right time of year really like to eat it. And goats like to eat it at most times of the year. So, but it will take careful management, because if you leave them in too long, they stop eating that and they start eating the trees instead. And this was something that didn't come up that much, but is something that I'm very interested in pursuing. The biggest benefit that people mentioned was the shade provided to the wildlife. And someone specifically said that as we see issues with climate change, this is going to be a more and more important problem to address for our livestock community. And this is one of the things that is one of the directions we're thinking of pursuing. People had a lot of questions. They're very interested in doing this, but they have a lot of questions, and they say there's a lot of information needed. Everyone seemed to think it would be useful to have demonstrations and examples of what good silvopasture looks like. And people wanted information on the economics, information on what the markets would be, particularly for the trees. So how can you get income off the trees beyond firewood? Are there nuts you can grow? Can you use them for fence posts? Can you make saw timber out of them? What are the constraints to that? How do you do that? Questions about what species would be good, what tree species, some tree species were discussed. The black locust grows fast. It's a nitrogen fixer. Those are nice parts of it, but it can be invasive. It has thorns. So there are pluses and minuses for all the different species. So there are questions about all the different species of trees. There are pluses and minuses for different livestock species. Questions about exactly how do you manage this? How do you establish savanna from forest, or how do you protect young trees if you're planting them? How to control invasive species through grazing. And a lot of discussion, which I think was right on target, about how do you figure out which areas are suitable and which aren't. The consensus was silvopasture makes sense, but it doesn't make sense everywhere. It makes sense in degraded woods, in places that are already being pastured. It makes sense in some overgrown pasture. It makes sense as part of the farm plan, but not all of it. So all of those questions need answers. So what are our next steps? As I mentioned before, I'm working with Keith Keeley, who's doing very similar work. And he's already received funding to start some case studies with 3 different farms that are doing silvopasture in three different ways. So we're starting some case studies. We want to work on some on-farm research. We have an agroforestry academy coming up. That's part of my work with SARE, which will train some foresters and some people in the technical colleges from Wisconsin, and a few farmers in agroforestry in general. And we're working on other educational and networking activities around agroforestry and specifically around silvopasture. And we are planning to submit a grant proposal to work with farmer networks with on-farm research on doing the on-farm research on how to do silvopasture as a buffering thing for climate change, as a way to keep animals cool in hot weather and also protect them in harsh winter weather, and as a way to do it in such a way that we're actually improving the stewardship of our woods. So how do we manage grazing in the woods through careful use of timing, through good use of rest periods, in a way that benefits the woods? So that's all that I have prepared. Do you have questions? Thoughts? Suggestions?
I'm sorry.
Oh.
Wouldn't the cows, the goats, wouldn't they go after the oaks first before they go after the honeysuckles and the buckthorn and multiflora rose? I can't see being multiflora rose. But...
Right. So it is a question of timing. Actually, and that's one of the things we need research on. And the experience really varies. Oak leaves are somewhat palatable, but generally not that palatable because they're very high in tannins. Although goats' tastes are very variable. But apparently they love multiflora rose, at least at the right time of year, according to this farmer who has goats. But again, it is an issue of timing. What you would want to use it for primarily is if you don't yet have oak regeneration, you would use it a few years in a row to try and clear out some of these other species that are outcompeting the oaks, and then allowing the oak regeneration to come in. If you have good oak regeneration, you probably don't want to turn goats into that forest. Now, what the people who manage, and cows are very different too. So beef cattle are more likely to, if the trees are very young, they're very likely to trample them. Otherwise, again, they'll eat the grass, or they'll eat things like the prickly ash, which is more nutritious for them before they'll eat the oaks. But you can't count on it, so you have to play it by ear, depending on where that forest is in its rotation and what your goals are for that land at that point in time. So yes, if you have a nice seedling advanced regeneration of oaks that are this high, I wouldn't do silvopasture in that stand of woods right then. Does that make sense?
How about foraging? Native grasses, is that considered, can the native grasses stand that if they get eaten off? Yeah. Go ahead.
So native grasses are primarily warm season grasses, and there's been research on using warm season grasses in a sort of savanna setting for grazing. And what they do well is they tend to grow better when it's hot and dry. They tend to perform better at that time. Their forage value is not as high as the cool season grasses. So farmers would typically prefer the cool season grasses, which also grow more, produce more. Well, actually a warm season grass will grow a lot, as we know, a prairie grass will grow a lot. But its nutritional value is not as high. So typically farmers, that's a conflict between doing full native savanna restoration and doing silvopasture. What you might do in a situation like that, and this is starting to be explored, is if as a landowner you're interested in doing that, you might contract with a neighbor to have your savanna grazed for a short period of time. And they would do it for free because their cows are getting some food. You'd get your mowing done for free, but they wouldn't. That's not something a farmer would plant to feed the cows, typically. Unless they have a passion for prairie, which is not unknown. They might plant a small area that way. Other questions?
How many trees would you need? An acre isn't a good enough. It's not site index mark. How many would you mark the trees? How many would you have in order to get the grasses to grow?
How many would you need to take out from a woods, or how many would you plant?
How many would you have, like in an acre or whatever?
How many trees?
Yeah.
This is one of those design questions, right? There are tons of different ways you could design it. So they're different. One of the challenges is how do you run your fence? And so the consensus that I got from these focus groups, and also this is pretty parallel to what I've seen from guidance from other parts of the country. Even though it would look really nice, you probably don't want to scatter your trees in a random pattern. You probably want to plant them in rows. And so then the question is, how far apart do you want those rows to be? And there's not a set answer to that. It depends on what your goals are, and that's one of the things that we might ultimately try to put together some research on. But if your primary goal is as a farmer and you just want shade, then you would run them along the outside of your paddocks so that you're not losing as much grazing ground when you have to fence the cows off from them when they're young. And So it would be whatever the width of your paddock would normally be, and you would run rows that far apart. You would probably plant double or triple rows of trees. That's the usual design recommendation within the rows. Does that make sense? Can you visualize that?
It doesn't to an extent. I have an existing forest. I just
So, okay.
thin it out
Right.
to where I can graze it. And it is,
So there, okay, so there what you want, the recommendation is you want to get to about a 50% canopy. So you'd want to do you think in terms of what is it, a C thinning? A pretty intensive thinning so that you've gone down. So, what's that? Yeah. Pretty heavy shelter wood. So you want to get down to between 50 and 80% canopy. So if you do an oak shelter wood, you'd usually go to a 60 to 70% canopy. So you'd thin it, you'd probably want to thin it down to 50% so that it can then fill into an 80% before you want to thin it again if you want to maintain good grazing land. And it also depends on the canopy. So if you have something like maples, they cast a very dense shade. They're a shade-tolerant tree. They're not a good tree for silvopasture. Something like an oak, which has a much lighter canopy, or a locust. Generally, a shade-intolerant tree will have a lighter canopy, and that would be a better candidate for this kind of woodland. What kind of woods do you have?
mostly this one here, it would mostly be oak, basswood, a little bit of hickory, some cherry, very few maples in that part there.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. The basswood tends to be a pretty dense shade too, I think. But the oak would be good. The cherry is pretty light, I think.
That would vary species by species because some of them with their rooting density, they may suffer more root damage. I mean, that's what we don't really have any guidelines to even think about this in this part of the world. So all of those questions are essentially open questions.
Right.
Like, so what do we know about these species and what
Right.
would we interpolate as what would happen if we
Right.
raised them?
Well, see, this is what's ironic about it. Why is this such a novel concept and idea of practice here when, come on, we've been managing forests in Germany and Northern Europe for hundreds of years? There must be a ton of research and empirical evidence out of North Europe.
Well, it's interesting. I can't comment as much on Germany, but I was in France last year and was talking to people a little bit about agroforestry there. Mm-hmm. They went through a kind of a similar evolution to what we have too, which is that it was a very traditional practice a very long time ago. And then in the 18th century, you got this professional forester thing starting, and they didn't want any livestock in the woods. And so you had 200 years of keeping livestock out of the woods, or if they were in the woods, it was, it wasn't talked about, and it was furtive or something like that. And now they're probably 10 years ahead of where we are here in terms of looking at agroforestry, but they're just going back and doing the research. And they have some very traditional systems there in different parts. So in Portugal, they have a system called the Hesa with the cork trees and the pigs eating the acorns under those trees. But as Mark said, our oaks are different from their cork oak, right? And so our species are just a little bit different. Our climate's a little bit different. Our soils are a little bit different. And those little differences are important when we look at managing these systems.
Or is there anyone who would come and look at, I have 27 acres that actually most of them in here.
Okay.
There's open grazing field, there's completely unmanaged woods. Who would be able to tell me how much work would be involved in prepping that land, aside from the $4,000 or more of fencing to make this, viable?
Right. That's what we're trying to get to, and we don't have that answer yet. So if you would be interested in having that work done, I'd love to take your name. If we we'd love what our next step is to try to figure out how to work with landowners and see if we can get a relationship with the university trying to do the research and the landowner trying to do the work. There are places that, depending on the funding, there are places you can apply to get research for that kind of thing. So the program I work with in Extension is called Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education, and it's a U.S. Department of Agriculture program. And one of the things they do is they have farmer-rancher grants. And this would be a potential farmer-rancher grant research question where you might be able to apply and get a few $1,000s to help you pay for some of that work. Now, there are constraints on what things they will and won't pay for. And one of the things, there's a lot of policy issues woven into this, and one of the things is, you mentioned the cost of fence. If you do fence around open pasture, and if you're going to do rotational grazing, you can get cost share from the Natural Resources Conservation Service from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. But they won't do cost share for fencing any kind of woodland, because they're in that same mindset that you don't want any cows, and you don't want to mix cows and woods. So they would probably, once we get the research, they might change that policy, but they're not going to change the policy until we get the research. I'm sorry, that's not a very helpful answer, but it's a good question that I'd love to have the answer to.
So if the French are 10 years ahead of us in this respect, then it's predictive of where you think your research might head to?
Well, as I say, they're working with very different systems, or somewhat different systems. I mean, I like to think that this is not something that 4 of us graduate students are interested in, and then we'll leave the university and it'll go away. I'd like to think that it will continue to garner interest. And I'm very encouraged that I got the response I did in the focus groups, that everybody was interested in talking about it. It was a self-selected group, as I say, but we were able to get them. I was able to get, and this, if you were not yourself farmers, you may not realize how astonishing this is. But for one reason or another, I did not have my farmer focus group set up until May. And I was kind of despairing, because after this really long cold spring, I was thinking, they're just never going to show up. They're never going to show up. They're way too busy. And almost all of them showed up. They were really interested in doing this. I got 7 farmers to show up on a perfect day to do outdoor field work in May. And so I think there's real significant interest in this, and I think we're going to make progress in it. But it's a very, one of the exciting but also one of the daunting things about it is it's a very complex system. When you do most agriculture research, right, you're doing one crop at a time, and it's a crop that you get your information from in 1 year, right? You plant corn, you do something different to it, and at the end of 4 months, you know how well the corn grew in response to a new fertilizer or a different spacing or something like that. And of course, you need to get several years of data because you need to know if it would only respond that way given that climate. But you get your results really quickly. You're only asking one question at a time. This is such a complex system, right? Do we do our trial in your woods, which is on, a certain kind of soil with the pre-existing pattern of oaks and so on? How do we compare that to when we do it, on your land, where the trees are different, the aspect is different? We can thin to the same density. We may get the results in terms of how good the forage is for the cows fairly quickly. We can get that in 3 or 4 years. But the results of what the long-term impacts of that are on the trees, that could take a lot longer. So it's a much more complex research question to figure out how to design that research.
Is there a different type of cattle that work better for this? I know Highlands will go and eat a lot of brush and things like that.
Right.
Versus your regular dairy cows or whatever.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. A lot of people say Highland are perfect for eating brush. Other people say if you train them, you can get beef cattle to eat just about anything. People are, because dairy cattle are going to be so, their milk yield is going to be so responsive, and they have such high nutrition requirements to produce the milk. People are much more cautious about asking, they're not going to want to ask dairy cows to clear brush for you. But Highland cattle are very popular for that, but then other people have said, no, you can, if you train them right, and if you put them in the right time of year, and if you manage it right, you can get dairy heifers to do this kind of grazing, and you can get other beef breeds to do it. So that's anecdotes. We don't have research on whether one is better than the other, but the anecdotes indicate that you can do it with the different kinds.
All right. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I'd like to thank Mark and Diane for their efforts